Thanks to everybody for coming. Thanks to Aaron for inviting me. It's been a pleasure so far to be here and talk with various people about philosophy for kids. This is something I really care about, I'm passionate about. As evidence of that, I don't really get paid to do it, but I still do it in my regular job. We have a Philosophy for Children Center. We run regular courses from the University of Washington where we're training students to go out into the local school district, but it's not actually part of my regular teaching load. It's just something I really believe in. I love doing. It's very invigorating and exciting to do with kids and with undergraduates. And I also am a parent, so I have kids and I see them loving philosophy when I lead them through philosophical discussions with some of the books, and I do thought experiments with them and that kind of thing. So, just to start, when we think about philosophy with kids, I think a lot of people's automatic response is, it's not going to work. Philosophy just isn't the right kind of subject matter for young people. They're not ready for it. And this really has a history in philosophy, right, in the history of philosophy. If we look back at Plato and the Republic, here's a quote from Book 7. When young people get their first taste of arguments, they misuse it by treating it as a game of contradiction. They imitate those who've refuted them by refuting others themselves, and like puppies, they enjoy dragging and tearing those around them with their arguments. Then they forcefully and quickly fall into disbelieving what they believed before. And as a result, they themselves and the whole of philosophy are discredited in the eyes of others. That's damning, right? We don't want to do that if it's going to discredit the whole discipline of philosophy. They're just, right, Plato's saying they're just not ready for it. He didn't think people were really ready for philosophy until 30 or beyond. So you undergraduates, if you're not non-traditional, right, you're really, you're getting in a little bit early here. We think he's wrong, right? He thought that because he thought 30-year-olds were going to be serious enough about the endeavor to really be using it to seek out truth about the world, and that other people would just play more like the sophists, right, to try to defend something even if they didn't really believe it, and just use rhetoric to be persuasive about things. They're not really going to be serious about the philosophy. And I have to say, I just think he's wrong, and people I work with, David Shapiro is one of my colleagues at the University of Washington Philosophy for Children program, agree. David has a recent book out called Plato Was Wrong. And then it's about thought experiments and games that he's done with kids all the way from kindergarten up through high school level. So why is it surprising to think kids can do philosophy? One, there's just the incredibly abstract nature of much of the subject matter, right? These are not tangible things that we can get our hands on. If we're going to talk about truth or justice or goodness, right? How are we going to talk about that with young people who are much more in the tangible world? It feels like it would just be too difficult for them to get their heads around what it is that we're talking about at that incredibly abstract level. Secondly, I think there's the complexity of the language. I just gave a few of my favorites, but right, for the non-philosophers in the audience anyway, transcendental aesthetic. We have a Kant class going right now at the graduate level at University of Washington. I'm talking to some of the first-year grad students. Like, what is this language? It's so dense, it's almost impossible to understand what he means by these terms. And right, even if you try to look them up, it's not clear what he's meaning. We have heteronomy, we have ontology, we have hermeneutics. In part of my work right now, I work with a neuroengineering center, and we always want to say epistemology, but that's a word that scares off engineers and scientists, right? They don't use that terminology, and so philosophers get caught up in this difficult language that we use, and that makes it inaccessible to other people. And then just the density of the prose that's there, even without the complicated words. So here's one of my favorites from Kierkegaard's The Sickness Unto Death. A human being is a spirit. But what is a spirit? Spirit is the self. But what's the self? The self, now listen closely, is a relation that relates itself to itself, or is the relations relating itself to itself in the relation. The self is not the relation, but is the relations relating itself to itself. You say, of course it is, right? Clearly. When I, as an early graduate student, first read this, I thought, it does sound like Dr. Seuss, right? I mean, there's a certain ridiculousness about the way the language is put together, and I was fantasizing maybe I could recreate the history of philosophy in Dr. Seuss-style books, sell them to all the parents who are interested in Baby Einstein products, right? And I would really have a different career. I never quite got around to it, but this is sort of a different form. It's not making money, but it's bringing philosophy to younger people. And I also just want to say, right, the word philosophy, I think philosophers themselves have a hard time defining exactly what philosophy is. It's an ongoing subject matter within philosophical circles. And so it can be a little off-putting to people who aren't familiar with it. They don't really know what we're talking about when we say we want to bring philosophy to young people. When I worked in Long Beach and I tried to get a Philosophy for Children program going, some of the administrators I talked with at middle level, so the principals of schools, said, "We'd really like what you've shown us. Could we call it something else? Like maybe higher critical thinking skills." Because other people won't be threatened by that, right? Won't be worried about what might happen within the context. And we really fought hard to say, no, philosophy really is a subject matter that should be accessible to more people. Let's not step away from the word. Let's educate people about what the word really means, what subject matter is covered under this heading. So why is that view wrong? Why do we think Plato was wrong, but also people who think it's just not, it's too difficult for kids to figure out? First, I would say education should start at the level of the learner, right? We don't have to use the same text. So when we do philosophy for kids, we don't go in there with Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Let's start, right, transcendental aesthetic, and see if we can understand that. We don't go in with Hegel. We don't. Sometimes, right, at high school level, we'll take things that we think are accessible at the level of the students. Descartes, Plato, right? There are great philosophers who wrote in an accessible style, but we'll also use other techniques to get them thinking about this material. We don't have to actually use the same high-level, dense, complex material. And right, that's the exact same thing we do in science education, in reading education, in math education. We don't start up here, we start with the very basics, and then we work our way up in complexity. Secondly, the aim of teaching or doing philosophy with kids is not teaching them the history of philosophy. So we don't necessarily go in wanting them to understand the content of what the pre-Socratic said, what the ancient Greeks said, right? How we've moved on in the modern period and on through history. We're really trying to get them to do philosophy, right? To develop the critical thinking skills that are part of the philosophical endeavor. So we're less focused on particular text. And often we don't even mention, right? They will come up with positions that are well known in the history of philosophy, but we don't even mention the names unless maybe at the end we want to say, that is so interesting because this point you came up with is a major move made by a famous philosopher named Descartes. But it's after the fact, right? It's not that they should know what Descartes said. Philosophy, I'd say, is the study of enduring human questions, right? Big, important questions. They're questions that almost all of us, not everyone necessarily, that we'll face at some time in our lives. We're curious about them, right? We want to know about the nature of friendship. When friends do things to us and we're not sure if we should pursue them or stay with them, we're in dilemmas. We don't know how to deal with that. And so we try to think carefully about friendship or about what's right and wrong when we're torn between two things, right? We want to know what we really know about a situation, whether it's in a court of law or elsewhere. So we're doing epistemology even without calling it that. And I just want to point out that kids are doing this too. In fact, there's this great quote at the beginning of a YouTube video I'm going to show you a little clip of, but not that piece, where Anthony Appiah says, Kwame Anthony Appiah, a famous philosopher at Princeton, says, kids are sort of natural philosophers in that they tend to push the why questions well beyond the range of when normal adults would stop. Any parent will recognize this, right? And in that way, they're very similar to philosophers. Right? We just push those questions beyond the level where most people stop. So kids are doing it quite naturally. When I've asked a 5th grade class, after just a really quick introduction to what philosophy is, to just take a moment and write down some of the questions that they think of, that they think are philosophical. These are some of them. Right? What are numbers? Where do they come from? How can they go on forever? What's the nature of this thing, this system that we have that seems to matter so much? Why do people hate each other? Which comes into, why do we have wars? Why are we in the particular wars that we're in? What does that mean? Is there a God? This always comes up. If there is a God, who created God, right? They're interested in cosmology and in thinking about whether everything has to have a cause. Is lying always wrong? I get into this with my own kids, right? My daughter lied to me about something, whether she had taken a bath, and I told her, I can check. I have a way to get independent evidence. Your dad was there. I will ask him. And she stuck with her story. And there was a consequence because she did, in fact, lie. And then, I don't know, maybe a week later, it was April Fool's Day, and I really got her with a good one. And then I told her she could take that to her preschool at the time, right, and get her teacher. And she looked at me, but Mommy, lying is wrong, right? Why are you telling this story? Why is it okay on April Fool's Day to tell stories? So complicated questions, right? When is lying acceptable? When is it not? Maybe it's not on April Fool's Day. Could I be someone else? I think that's a really interesting question about identity, right? They're thinking about these things maybe as they're going to bed, maybe as they're riding in a car on a long-distance trip. So we want to focus on the questions that they have and give them a little bit of uptake. So again, people might then say, okay, so kids are natural philosophers. They're asking questions all the time of this nature. Why do we have to do philosophy in schools? They're already little philosophers. Great, let them be little philosophers. But of course, they have this natural wonder about the world, but they haven't yet developed the critical thinking skills to figure out how to work their way through them. They're curious about them. They're curious about the world and they want to know these things, but they don't know how to pursue them. And they certainly don't have the skills to pursue them in a group dialogue, right? They just haven't figured that out, especially in the very younger grades. Secondly, I think it's really important to give them uptake for these questions. So school teachers are certainly constrained by standards that they have to meet, subjects that they have to cover. Parents, I think, are often uncomfortable talking about some of the subjects, in part because they don't think there are answers, or they don't know what the answers are, or they feel embarrassed that they don't yet know what the answers are, and here they are midway through life, right? And so they'll divert, they'll ignore them, they don't give any uptake to them. And what that teaches kids is that these are not important questions. Right? Even though they're big fundamental questions the kids are already asking, by not giving any uptake or space for the questions, helping them explore them, we just teach them that they're not important. And yet, these are really fundamental questions about what it is to be a human, right? About figuring out the world and our place in it. So I think they really are very important questions. We have to give them some space to explore those questions then. And lastly, showing them that adults don't have all the answers, I think is really important. We are also perplexed by philosophical problems. We don't have to go in saying, yes, and I can tell you the answer to this problem. We can share that perplexity with them. And I think it's actually quite refreshing and empowering for the young student to see that they're a real co-inquirer in the process, that the teacher or the facilitator isn't looking for a particular answer, but trying to explore the question with them. So what's the general structure of a philosophy for children session? Depending on the age group and the level of concentration, right, somewhere from 30 minutes up to 60 minutes typically. It's better with smaller groups. Most of the classes that we go and talk to are about 28 students. It's hard, 28 students to have a discussion because everybody wants to be part of it. But if you have something at the beginning that sparks the discussion and you want to have something at the end, then people have less than a minute, really, just to participate and say their part. So we try to divide them into smaller groups when we can. But I should say, we also do it with groups of 28 or 30. The format, we typically have some kind of stimulus, right? Some kind of discussion spark that everyone does together, that brings us onto the same page so that we can focus our minds together. It might be a thought experiment, a game, some sort of shared reading. After doing that together, a moment of reflection. How often does that happen? Right? I mean, just in our day-to-day lives as adults, but also in the school classroom, they don't have so many opportunities just to stop and not be pushing towards something that they have to do, but just to stop and reflect on that. So it's enforced, right? A couple of minutes just of reflection on what we just heard. And then we ask the kids themselves to produce questions. As I said to the group earlier, philosophers have a hard time sometimes in a big audience, right, at a colloquium talk, getting their comment into the form of a question that they can say in a minute or less, because we tend to ramble on. Kids, too, have a hard time formulating their concern into a question, but I think that's an important kind of language arts skill that they build, right? They're reading critically to be able to come up with a question, and then they have to put it in the form of a question. Then there's a moment where we do some sorting of the questions. And this might look just like busy work, right? Something you have to do before you get to the philosophy. But there is actually philosophical content even there in the sorting of the questions. So we're thinking about which questions fit together, which ones, even though they're coming from different students or groups of students, Which ones cover the same material even though they're actually put in a different way, right, using different language? Is there any priority order where it would really help us if we focus on this question before we get to that one because it assumes something in the first, right? They're doing this categorizing work, and we're helping them do that before we actually jump into the content of the discussion. So then this discussion follows, right? We have some self-imposed rules. Often in the first session, we'll talk to them about how to have a good discussion together, how to have a philosophy discussion. When they jump into the discussion, right, if they have to raise hands or not, that they have to respond directly to what the person before them said, I agree because, or I disagree because, so that there's this trail going, right, a line through the discussion rather than just this comment, that comment, this comment, that comment. And then at the end, some kind of closure. Something before the bell rings and everybody rushes off, heads full of interesting philosophical thoughts, to stop for a second and reflect back on the process. What did we just do? Right? Because the reality is you can have really great discussions, but if you don't take a moment to reflect on what happened in the discussion, sometimes the content gets lost. You walk out to your next class, you go on to art or PE or whatever it is, and you just sort of lose track of what you had done there. It just feels like talking. And students often think that talking doesn't get us anywhere. So we want to say these are dialogues, right? They're discussions that are pushing us towards something, making progress in the discussion. So we want to reflect back on the process and figure out if we've made any forward movement. Have we carved away some views that really don't work, or pointed out some inconsistencies between beliefs that we initially had when we came into the room together? Have we shown that we need to identify or define some term before we can move on to the next thing, right? Even though it can feel like negative progress in a way, carving away falsehoods, it is a certain kind of progress forward. And sometimes we'll have them do some kind of final writing exercise or drawing exercise, depending on their age, where we ask them to reflect back on the meaning of this discussion for them, right? So write a paragraph or a page or draw a picture that's demonstrating what you took out of this particular discussion. So let me just lead you through some of the discussion sparking things. Thought experiments, right? This is what philosophers do. We don't need expensive labs. We just do this. And we think about things, propose hypothetical possibilities. The ring of Gyges, probably a lot of people know from Plato. Imagine you have a ring that makes you invisible. You put it on, twist it. You just disappeared from sight. It's fun. Everybody likes to think about it. It's in Harry Potter, Cloak of Invisibility, different mode there. Or it's in The Lord of the Rings, right? This ring of power. So what would you do with this ring if you could become invisible? It's fun for them to explore. It feels like a game, right? I would do this. I would do that. Would they do good things? It's kind of rare, sadly, when you talk to students, right, that they're talking about good things they would do, helping people, why they would do that anonymously. But they'll talk, surprisingly, about things that I wouldn't expect them to say in front of their teachers. I would cheat on the test. I would go up and look at the teacher's desk and get the answers, right, and then go back to right in front of their teacher, they say it. And so then we can explore, right? So if you would do some of these things when you're invisible, why are you not doing them when you're visible? Well, because I'd be caught. Is that what makes it wrong? That you would be caught? That you would be punished? Right? Or are you punished because it's wrong? And if that's the case, let's think about why it's wrong. Let's think about the reasons why it's wrong. Let's, universalize the maximum of cheating, to use Kantian language. But with them, I might just say, let's think about what would happen if everybody cheated in this way, if they could. Would we really gain knowledge through this process of education, right? Would it be helpful for us to be in this school setting? We have really interesting discussions starting just from that basic kind of thought experiment. The experience machine is another famous philosophical thought experiment. Imagine you could sign up to be put into, maybe a booth where you have a lot of brain inputs. Once you're in there and the things are hooked up, you won't recognize that that's not reality, much like the Matrix, right? Let's say you can trust the programmers who are going to design it for you, and we can make sure that on balance you're going to have more happy experiences than you would be likely to have in your actual authentic life. Who's going to sign up? It's interesting to see who in a class wants to sign up. And sad sometimes, right? Because sometimes the kids who want to sign up have pretty miserable lives right now, and so they think, wow, if I could get that, that looks pretty attractive. Others clearly have strong intuitions that we should not be entering that thing. Well, why not, right? And then we start exploring. And what we get to is a discussion about the nature of happiness, right? Is happiness coming from the particular sensations that we get, the belief that certain things are happening around us, or do we care about real relationships, about some authenticity of our experience? And again, right, you can have a really interesting discussion just out of this very simple kind of thought experiment to get them going. Ship of Theseus is another one, a boat where a plank is changed. Every plank is changed over time until it looks like you have a new boat. Is it the same boat? What if we had the pile of old planks in a junkyard and some crafty person put it all back together in the same shape? Which one is the Ship of Theseus, right? The one that has slowly been replaced over time and always been in that identity, or the one that's contains all the physical material that was there with the original one? Interesting questions about the nature of identity, how identities change over time, which can then be turned into questions about personal identity, right? Their own sense of themselves as having an identity, how their identities change over time. Is there something essential to their identity that has to be there for them to be them? Right, we're getting to questions now in philosophy about the difference between a substance and an attribute, maybe. What are attributes about me that can change over time, whereas I still notice that it's me who's changing over time, not me becoming a new thing, a new person. I won't go into the inverted spectrum. That's another one, good one in philosophy of mind, right? You flip the colors, and can I really tell based on the language that I use? There are a lot of these in this great intro to philosophy designed for college students. Doing philosophy and introduction through thought experiments. You know, you could use them at any age level, even though that book itself is designed for a college level. Philosophical games. So thought experiments are great as a way to start things off, but philosophical games are also quite fun. I'll just go through a couple of these. What's your reason? This is a game my colleague David Shapiro came up with. He has them write down something that they believe, and then they have a little discussion about the nature, something they believe is true, just to be complete. They have a little discussion about the nature of belief and how we know things, and the difference between an explanation for a belief and a justification for a belief. Right? So you might be able to explain why you believe things because you were brought up in X, Y, or Z culture, or this is what your parents taught you to believe. But does that justify the belief? Like, what's required for justification? Some kind of evidence or some reason that's linked up to that belief. Then he says, okay, do it again. Write a new belief, something that you believe to be true. And on the back, write 3 reasons that you believe that to be true. Okay, so they do that exercise. And then they have a little game. They read the reasons. Can you come up with the belief based on the reasons that are there? And they know each other, right, within a classroom. So it can be really interesting for them to think about in this process of a game. He awards points and everything, right? Whether or not the reasons that were listed actually should lead you to that belief. Because if they really can't come up with the belief, then there's this suggestion there's a bit of a disconnect between the two, right? So again, it looks like fun, but they're getting to these critical thinking kinds of skills through them. Is Life Fair is another favorite one of mine. We'll hand out little cards. It will give you a family situation, a job situation, and a housing situation, everywhere from being homeless, right, to having a huge mansion, lots of things in between, single mom, right, person with a huge family, who knows, lots of things in between there. And we have them role play, right? Tell a little story about who you are and how you came to have these particular things, because often they don't obviously go together, because it's just random distribution. So we have a discussion about who they are, and then we say, we have some benefits to distribute. How do you think we ought to distribute them, right? We have a free education, right? Or we have some stipends that you can use in any way you want. Who should get them, and on what basis? Well, they're role-playing, right? So they're looking out for their character. But then they're going to talk about, should it be done by need? Should it be done by desert? Should it be done by a lottery system, right? Lots of different principles of distribution we might use that they can come up with. And we fight about it, we talk about it, right? Argue about which one is justifiable. Then we have them turn in their identities. And we say, now we're going to redistribute these identities. You don't know who you're going to be, right? It's Rawls's veil of ignorance for philosophers. You don't know who you're going to be. Now what do you think about the fair rules of distribution? And it just puts them in a different state of mind, because they're trying to imagine if they don't know which character they're going to play, what would they want to have happen? Again, it gets at great philosophical material in social and political philosophy through a game format that's very accessible to even young children. And David has a lot of these. I just put up the picture of his book cover. And I'm not going to go through all the rest of them, but there are lots of different avenues in that are just about games. Then picture books. I just did a workshop with Frederick. For some of you, The Big Box is another favorite of mine, Toni Morrison's sort of extended poem on the nature of freedom. Kids who can't handle their freedom are put in a big brown box. The doors only open one way. There are locks. They have lots of pictures of nature and sound recordings of nature, but they can't actually interact with nature when they're in there. But they get lots of things like princess phones and TV and other things that not every kid reading the book will have or have access to. So there's this interesting question about the nature of freedom there. Are we free? How valuable is freedom? Would we trade it for some of these material goods that the kids are getting in the box when they're there? The refrain is sort of the adults are saying, you can't handle your freedom. And then the kids repeat back, but if you get to say what's free, then it's not my freedom or free. And so there's a great discussion that comes out of it about the nature of rules and who should make them, who has the authority to make them. And a refrain about how beavers chew trees when they need them and seagulls squawk and other animals get to follow their instincts, right? So why are human children different in this regard? Why do they have to obey all these rules? I'm just going to say one more thing about this other picture book. One of my favorites, Duck, Death, and the Tulip. It's by a German author, Duck. Is walking along and she thinks somebody's following her and she looks behind her. There's Death. He's not super scary. You don't see him on the cover here. He sort of has a skull head and a loose shift. She says, oh, have you come for me? And he says, no, I've been with you all your life. I'm glad you finally noticed me. And then she says, but are you going to take me away now? Is it my time? And he says, no, death doesn't do that. Life does that. Think of all the things in life. Accidents, colds, fox, right? So he's playing with her a little bit, but he says, I don't do that. Things in life take care of that. Over time, they sort of challenge each other to do things. They become friends. They go up to the top of the tree, and Duck reflects down on the empty pond and thinks, is this what it's going to be like when I die? The empty pond, no duck on it. And Death comforts her, and he says, really, when you're dead, you're not going to be here looking at the pond to notice that it's empty. And so you won't have that thought when you're dead. And then they talk about other things. At the end, Duck dies. Death comforts her as she dies. And then he sends her down the river with the tulip, which is, we always talk about why is there a tulip in there. And the last line of the book is, as Death watched Duck's body go off right into the horizon, he felt almost moved. And then he said, well, but that's life. And so it doesn't tell you a lot about what you should think about death and life, but it's this provocative, interesting little story. My kids love it. Other people that I work with initially said, ooh, it might be too scary for the really young kids. My kids are 3 and 7. They love to read this book and talk about it. And when I asked my daughter, I don't know, maybe 6 months later as I was developing a talk, what do you remember about that book? What was that book really about? Well, death and the duck. She said, and it kind of shows you how death can be your friend in some ways. Really interesting, that's the thing that sticks with her. So I think there are lots of great picture books, not designed by philosophers, not focused on raising philosophical issues, but the picture books that really grab us, I think, have deep philosophical themes in them. Chapter books, right, for somewhat older kids. These are a few of my favorites. This is a very recent favorite, The Fault in Our Stars. Tuck Everlasting, one of my long-term favorites. It's about a family that they discover a well, drinking the water makes them immortal. They learn that it's not the best thing to be immortal, but they know many people seek that. And so they try to keep it a secret. A young girl discovers the well, and she has to make a choice. Should she drink the water and stay with this family who's now immortal, or should she not drink it? And there's just a lovely, lovely chapter where the father tries to explain to her with great urgency, because he thinks it matters so much, why this is not a good thing. And, it's beautiful. You can just pull the one chapter out if you need to. the students have a really great time talking about this thing, immortality. It's not available, right? It is a thought experiment, at least in this world, right? But they can talk about why that might be a benefit, why we might seek it, what are the downsides, and have really great, I think, very deep discussions about that. Okay, then the discussion. We tend to start by recapping the story, especially if it's a longer one, just to make sure everybody was following along with what was going on. The kids create questions. There are some lesson guides that are out there. Tom Wartenberg, a friend of mine who does this at Mount Holyoke, has a book and a website where they have a lot of suggested questions that you might start with. We tend to think it's better to have those questions in your back pocket as a facilitator rather than starting with them. I think it's important to start with what the kids are most interested in the material. But of course, if they're having a hard time, it's always handy to have something that you can turn to that might at least initially spark the discussion. Again, rules about how they participate. I agree, I disagree because of something. And I just want to highlight the facilitator's role is not to teach them a certain point about philosophy or lead the students to believe what the facilitator believes. I mean, these are deep, difficult questions. We want them to figure out how they might go about answering the questions themselves rather than getting to a particular position. And that's a hard thing to do for many facilitators, right? To step back a little bit from engaging and saying what our view is to really trying to facilitate that. So saying things like that's a good counterexample, right? You can call moves that they're making that they may not be aware that they're making as they're doing it. So I hear you saying that you disagree with somebody, and let's think about these two differing opinions. What do the rest of you think? Trying to draw students in so that they talk to each other rather than just through the facilitator. And I would say, too, at least sometimes playing the devil's advocate, right? If it feels like a discussion is only in one zone and there are some clear other positions that might be useful to at least throw in there, that you don't have to be fully removed. You might, has anybody thought about X, right? Just, I'm not saying it's right. Let's just think about that. Then you can move the discussion forward that way, too. So I want to give you just a couple of examples of how this works, because I think these are really moving. So you get the idea, right? I think it's just helpful to see how kids are actually doing it as opposed to me talking about it. I want to give you just one more. This is an older clip from Matthew Lipman's program in Montclair. She still disagrees. There's more to that, right? It's very interesting and entertaining. There's a little clip at the end where one little girl says, I think at the next discussion they have, that she thinks you only have so many thoughts per day, and then when you're done, they're just used up. You just stop thinking. That's right. So you see them, they're thinking about thinking. They're thinking about what the process is, how it works, where it's coming from, what its relation is to them, right, to their identities. They're also really clearly learning to express their ideas. And I think this comes out so clearly with the video from Tom. The little girl, she's just working with her hands and trying to say this thing that she so believes, but it's hard to get it into words, right? But she's doing it. She's practicing, figuring out how to express herself with what are relatively abstract ideas. And you can also see, I think, especially in this latter one, how they really do learn to respond to each other, right? So they're not always going through the teacher or through the facilitator. They're agreeing and disagreeing, and they're getting heated, right? They're excited about this topic, and they want to figure it out. Okay, so, oops. Help. Let's do it. There. Who can do this, right? Who can lead a philosophy session? Certainly teachers can, right? In different programs around the world, around North America, we do training workshops for teachers to get a feel for it, to figure out how it's working, maybe to be paired with a mentor teacher or a philosopher. Sometimes we do it through partnerships. In our program, we send undergraduates out or grad students to partner with teachers. The teachers often know more about their particular class and about classroom control and that kind of thing. The philosophers know more about philosophy, and they work together to build these discussions. We have started a teacher learning community at one of the schools we work with, where we're drawing from kindergarten up through 5th grade. It's an elementary school. The teachers meet with us once a month at the school, and we have our own little philosophical learning community where we talk about some of the books, some of the thought experiments, and other things. We have practice sessions so that they see how it works. We're adults, not pretending to be kids, but just exploring the ideas in there, and then they can take that back to their classrooms. And also there are some places, we're exploring how to do this right now at the University of Washington, that do pre-service courses in schools of ed. So right, taking teachers in training and showing them how they could do philosophy with kids, and then it's something they can take to the classrooms where they student teach. Using undergraduates, right, it's an interesting question whether they need to be philosophy majors or not. We allow people who aren't philosophy majors to take our course. They typically are not comfortable with doing it unless they at least know something about philosophy, even if it's not through being a major. But sometimes you compare people, right? One who doesn't have a lot of philosophy background with somebody who has more, and they work quite well together. And of course, grad students too. As I said to the workshop earlier, in some places too, they make use of just older kids within their school. So they'll bring in an 8th grader to talk to a 5th grade class, or they'll bring in a 5th grader to work with a kindergarten class, doing some training about how to lead a discussion, but then letting them help out as a way to, again, reduce the size of any particular discussion group. So how much philosophy background is required? This is, I'd say, a really widely debated topic right now within the community of people who do philosophy for children. From my experience, there are some people who are really quite good at it and don't have a lot of philosophy background, formal philosophy training. They just have this kind of sensitive philosophical ear, and they can hear some of the questions coming out. They don't always come out that clearly, right? So you have to be attuned to discern that little gem that's in there. Sometimes philosophers are better at that, but not all the time. I think one of the dangers of having trained philosophers in there is that we already have this difficult language, and we have names to refer to positions, and it's so much easier just to say, oh yeah, it's just like Kant said. Even if the student doesn't fully understand what Kant said, right? It sort of identifies it, categorizes it, and then we're done with that. So sometimes I think it can be better not to have all that training, because it's hard to put it behind you, or the names behind you, just to focus on what the kids are really exploring right at this moment. But of course, the worry on the other side is that you'll get teachers or students who don't have much philosophy experience. I've observed them, right? And you just see these beautiful gems that are in what the kids are saying, and they just pass right over them. Just on to the next question. They don't see it, right? They don't hear it there. And so figuring out ways to help people develop that skill, I think, is something that this community has to work on. There are books out there about how to do this kind of thing. My colleague Jana Moore-Lone has a book out trying to help parents figure out how they can have philosophical conversations with their children, and giving them certain kinds of guidelines that they might work with. What I would say, if we step away from just the philosophy background, is that you have to have this kind of comfort with uncertainty, this willingness to share the perplexity that the students are sharing. Because if it makes you really uncomfortable not to know the answer, this is really not for you, right? You have to be comfortable thinking that the conversation can go in a direction that you never expected it to go in, right? I always tell my students, be prepared with a lot of questions that you think will come up from this particular reading. Sometimes you're surprised. They don't come up, but another really interesting 3 or 4 do, and that's what the students are most interested in. You have to be ready to head down that track, right, with those students. And then, right, definitely a requirement is having respect for kids and for the kinds of thinking that they can do. I think it's too common in our world for adults especially just to think that kids don't have any capacity like that. They're not ready for it. And if you don't really listen respectfully to what they say, you won't be able to do this successfully. So a few guidelines. Encourage the students to build on each other's ideas, right? Developing those ideas so it's not any one kid doing it on his own or her own. Show the students, right, this is part of respecting them, that what they say really makes you think, right? It's not, oh yeah, I've heard this before, I've been teaching philosophy for 20 years, but wow, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. And what I have found is that you often will find completely new creative ways of thinking about some of these 1,000-year-old questions, right? Just because they're very fresh about their perspective on them. Encouraging the students to speak to one another, right? Again, I agree, I disagree, so that they control the conversation as opposed to you always stepping in. And then some leading questions, right? Just some general ideas that you can use as a facilitator. These are up on our website. Okay, so why are we doing this? What are the aims? Different people will parse this out in different ways. I tend to think of them in 3 broad categories. One is about critical and creative thinking skills. right? Building their reasoning ability, identifying assumptions, thinking about alternate possibilities, considering reasons in favor and against a view, trying to understand different perspectives, formulating their own, right? Even once you understand different ones, you sometimes are at a loss for what you should think now. So trying to pull that together and formulate what you think about something and having some reasons for it. But beyond just the cognitive stuff, I think it's also a really important skill that they're learning that's social and behavioral, right? They learn how to have a dialogue together. They learn how to listen respectfully to each other. They learn what counts as a relevant reason and why they need to offer that, right? If you watch talk shows, at least in our country, I hope they're better here, they just talk past each other so often. It's just infuriating, right? If you care about dialogue, to listen to some of these shouting heads talking about politics, and they never actually track their points. They make irrelevant comments, right? So teaching them at a very young age to listen carefully and make sure that the comment they're making is relevant to what was said, and then helping to move the discussion forward in some way. And those would be great skills to develop, right? Both of those. But I also think, and again, this is why I think it's not just higher critical thinking skills, it's philosophical awareness, right? It's awareness that these are big questions that have been around for a long time that humans are interested in exploring and have lots of different ways of exploring. And you can participate in that big conversation through time, right? Recognizing what science can't tell us. There are some things we just can't experiment on and figure out, right? They're of a different nature. Figuring out how we're going to think about values, right? Also just identifying what counts as a philosophical kind of question, I think, is an important skill for them to. Okay, so now, does it work? I'm going to go really quickly. I haven't focused a lot of my time and effort on assessment projects, but I want to tell you about a few that I know of that are out there. So Tricky and Topping, I think they're educational psychologists, but they're very interested in this philosophy for children movement. They tested this in Scotland, in Clackamshire. 1 hour a week of philosophy instruction, discussions like the kind of thing that I just talked about. They were working with 10-year-olds. They did a comparison to control groups. They did a pre-test and a post-test. They did video of the students in the process as they were having these discussions, and then they analyzed those. They used some standardized tests to measure sort of quantitative abilities, cognitive abilities. And then they also did an analysis of various questionnaires they gave both to the teachers and to the individual students. And that was only after the intervention, the philosophy intervention. They measured developments in cognitive ability using CAT and MALS. So the CAT is the cognitive abilities test. It's like a very standard kind of test to measure something like what people call IQ, right? People often think of it as an innate ability. You have it or you don't, or you have it to differing degrees. They do verbal analogies. They do nonverbal analogies where they're looking at figures. They do sentence completion. They do quantitative analogies or finishing a number series or putting together an equation. Just basic kinds of cognitive capacities. So they measure that pre and post. They did developments in critical reasoning. Oh, I know, the MALS. This is myself as a learner scale, where they say this correlates highly with the cognitive abilities, with the various tests for cognitive ability, but it's measuring something like academic self-concept. So how do I see myself as a learner in the world? Maybe also bordering on academic self-esteem. And they would answer a rating scale, 1 to 5, right? How much do you agree with something like, I need lots of help with my work, or various other things like that. Then they look back at the video. When they were doing video analysis, they were looking for instances of when the kids were offering reasons that were relevant to the things that they said. They had coders that were trained. They had consistency across the coders and that kind of thing. And then again, the questionnaires at the end. And what they found, and I'm sorry I don't have a graph here. This is I wasn't able to pull it and put it on the PowerPoint. I'm new to PowerPoint things. But they found very statistically significant improvements in cognitive abilities for the philosophy group, not, interestingly, for the controls. In this case, it was just a different class doing whatever their standard coursework was. So they're still learning, right? They're still getting an education, but they didn't find these changes on those cognitive tests, on the CAT or the MALS. Significant improvements in their critical reasoning skills. Again, no change for the controls. Increased classroom discussion by the philosophy students. They were more active, more engaged in what the discussion was, and they gave much more elaborate answers, right? Rather than sort of the 1 or 2 word things, they were giving elaborate answers, exploring the reasons that they had and that sort of thing. They also noticed a change in the teachers, where the teachers were offering many more open-ended questions rather than searching for some particular closed answer. Interestingly, right, so this was after 16 months of a philosophy intervention. 2 years later, after the end of that 16 months, they went back and retested. And these differences persisted. And they hadn't had philosophy in the intervening years. So it's not as though it's this little blip that occurs, you do well as you're active in it, and then it just falls away. Although I would still encourage people to continue doing philosophy, right? But they found that these changes persisted over time. And I should say, too, one of the things that they talk about in their piece, I gave you the citation there, is that a lot of people these days in educational circles or others talk about some sort of IQ or intelligence testing as something that's really innate. It's relatively immovable, right? We test 5-year-olds to see whether they go into special classes, and we think we're doing some great service by separating them and giving them appropriate education. But what they found, what they're claiming they found, is that these skills can be enhanced and developed incrementally with the right kinds of education. Okay, another study quickly. This is Karen Walker. She was a student with Tom Wartenberg at Mount Holyoke. 12 weeks of weekly philosophy instruction, again, just for an hour with second grade students this time. They had an argumentation skills task. They had, I don't know, maybe 6 of these where in a book, it was a sort of pro and con book. Here's what some people believe. Here's what other people believe. What do you think? Right? And what are the reasons you have for your belief? Can you see the reasons on the other side? How do you respond to those reasons? That kind of thing. And then they coded those. And so here's a little graph from them. So time 2 was at the end of the first semester after their 12 weeks, and then they flip-flopped their groups. In their control, they had them reading picture books and discussing them because they thought that would be a similar enough control, but they were talking about art history more than they were about philosophy. And when they flipped the groups, the other group at time 3 came up to the same level on these argumentative skills tests. Then just 2 more quick ones. I'm almost done. Lynne Hinton is a principal of a school in Australia, in Brisbane. She got interested in philosophy for children. She decided to implement it across the whole school. So in our book, she has a piece about a whole school approach to philosophy. Again, it was only 1 hour a week. This is not a lot of time eaten up in the curriculum. Their school, it was in inner city Brisbane. It was performing below the state standard and way below the national standard at the time they started doing standardized testing in Australia. In 1 year, after implementing this philosophy program, they'd already made significant progress towards those goals. In 5 years, they were way above both the state and the national levels. Now, right, this is not necessarily causal. It could be something about Lynne's amazing presence as a principal in the school, about other things that were happening. She said people didn't want to believe their results. Like, you're getting different kids. Most of their kids were getting free lunches, right? Didn't come from backgrounds where they're super privileged. Weren't testing high when they initially came in. But by having this only 1 day a week, 1 hour a week, they were showing these drastic improvements. And I want to remind you that they're not teaching to these tests. So they're not thinking, ooh, what do we ask on the cognitive abilities test? Not that they use that in Australia, and then let's practice verbal analogies, right, or figure analogies. They're talking about philosophy, and they're figuring out ways of thinking about their process of thinking. And what also happens is that they improve on these kinds of standardized tests. Just a couple of quotes here. This is from Lynne's piece that's going to come out in our book soon. From the outset, children took to philosophy like the proverbial fish to water. They understood and enjoyed, and then she lists a lot of things, the collaborative nature of the activity, using all your brains together at once, the deep issues discussed, a study of the way life works, a place where you're able to reflect on life, and the intellectual challenges invoked. So using the thinking part of your brain. Yet they did it at their own level of development, discussing mysteries like, is it better to be smart or pretty? She says, children would bounce into my office saying things such as, I have a great question for philosophy. What makes me, me? And I've thought of something really interesting. For every right answer, there's an infinite number of wrong ones. right? They're thinking, they're excited about it. They want to go to their principal's office to talk through the philosophical thinking that they're doing. And then she says, just one other quote I pulled out, when we began this, our focus was to improve academic outcomes by teaching children to think. What we didn't foresee was that children who learn to think well through doing philosophy think about a lot more than just the academic side of their lives. We also didn't foresee how the respect that's generated in the community of inquiry spills out everywhere. The children learn to listen to one another, explore disagreements respectfully, see things from other points of view, and have the courage of their well-thought-out convictions. Right? So it's spreading from just in the philosophy classroom once a week to other things that they study and also to other parts of their lives. The thing I want to point out about this quote, it's from the woman working with third grade students who are primarily from immigrant families in Connecticut. She says, perhaps the most important thing, right, it helped them develop the mindset that learning's not about rushing towards a predetermined answer. Learning's about thinking. It's a process. My students see the struggle. During philosophy lessons, they regularly get frustrated when I challenge them to articulate clearer reasons for their answers, or when I carefully suggest that their argument is inconsistent or invalid. My students often wish to have the right answer more quickly, don't we all? However, in muddling through, they develop the intellectual stamina that will be needed to think through more complex problems. In math, my students are more likely to work through a complex application problem using trial and error than they were at the start of the year. Right? So she's pointing out that in her view, right, we're not measuring this with some standardized test, but in her view, their abilities that they're developing in the philosophy class are spreading across the other academic disciplines as well. So now my students know that solving a problem can be a process. So some resources, and I'll just finish up, right? Our center has a website with a whole lot of, we just greatly expanded the number of picture books and novels that have sort of suggestions about the kinds of philosophical questions that may come out of them, and some questions you might have in your back pocket if you take them into a classroom. Tom Wartenberg's site, Teaching Children Philosophy, is another great one with a lot of different picture books included. Plato is the philosophy learning and teaching organization. They are offering advice about teaching philosophy at every level, but primarily about pre-college philosophy. Again, the Montclair program and the Squire Family Foundation is an interesting private foundation in New York. They're focused on the U.S. context, but their mission is to increase and enhance pre-college philosophy. So there are a lot of resources up on their website about ways to do this. And I should just say, right, at the close of the talk, I think it's a really fun, interesting, invigorating thing to do for philosophers. When I've worked with younger students, undergrads, both philosophers and non-philosophers, they get excited. Right? These are interesting, compelling conversations that are given or that are started by very accessible content. Nobody's worried about getting a picture book wrong. Right? If you read Kant, you're worried that you just didn't get it right. And you're a little hesitant to enter the conversation for fear that you just completely misread it and you're going to show the evidence of your stupidity right in front of everybody else. But we don't have that problem with picture books. We all get the story. They're right there. But so many great deep issues are contained within those stories. And what we have to do is just show kids, other people, right, how we can pull those out and develop our thinking skills with them. So that's my thing. I'm happy to talk about objections or methods or other things in the discussion. Thank you. Questions? Comments? I make the students put it in the form of a question. I'll accept comments. Yeah.
I'm curious if you could maybe talk a little bit more about how you would approach religion or discuss the religious beliefs that are aligned from them.
I think it's a great question, right? And where I am, people aren't concerned about this sort of thing, but in lots of other parts of the world or parts of the United States too, it's the primary concern. And I will just tell a little story and then talk about it a bit. So when I went into the 5th grade class in Long Beach, in this case, on Friday afternoons, they did drama, science, art, or philosophy. Maybe there was one other thing. And so we had the kids on our own, right? And then they went in small groups with other teachers. And the first day of philosophy, right, we talked about what philosophy is. They wrote down their philosophical questions. Some of them were about whether God exists, and if he does, who created God. And I said to them, This is a great question, right? It's a really burning question that most humans ask themselves at some point. So good for you, right? You identified it and you're thinking about it. It's a question that we're not directly allowed to address in the class because the teachers have been very clear with me. This is not allowable territory, right? Does God exist? So we just can't, right? We have a separation of church and state in this country and we're not allowed to talk about it. But I encourage you to go talk to your parent. If you're a religious person, to talk to your religious leader, right? Your pastor, your priest, whomever it is. But I do want you to see that there's another way that we approach a question that's housed within it, which is, does everything have a cause? Right? So that's the question at the heart of this question. Does everything in the world have a cause? And then does there have to be a first cause, which is uncaused? Right? You don't have to talk in the language of God, although we know that's going on, right? But we can talk about it in terms of first causes, and right? Philosophers have talked about this for a long time. So I thought we proceeded to have a very nice conversation about whether everything had a cause, or if some things could be infinite, if infinite things were caused, right? What that would mean. I mean, it was a great conversation. They went back to their classroom, and the teacher said, "What did you guys talk about? First day of philosophy, whether or not God exists." It's just like, oh my God, I thought I was clear. And so I said, that's not what we talked about. But it's interesting because they might well go home, report to their parents, wow, we talked in philosophy about whether or not God exists. But no, we didn't say that God exists or doesn't exist. So even if they reported as we talked about that, parents might legitimately be worried, right, from different belief systems. I'd say then what we've done is say, if any parent's concerned about it, come in and watch a session. And what you're going to see is that we aren't trying to push a particular position. We're just trying to explore some of these big ideas. And when we feel like we're bumping up against laws, right, we're just going to tell the kids that this is a really interesting question, but it's not something that we can talk about right here. Right? I don't think it fully answers the problem, which is always going to be lurking there. But we have had parents come and sit in on sessions, and we've never had people complain about that. Once, I should say, we've had a parent pull a kid out of philosophy, but they never came to observe, and they just said they don't want their kid to do it. I don't know what the kid told them about what happened the first day. But that kid went to the library. The teacher was still very excited about having it happen there, and we continued on. Other questions? Yeah.
We've got a mic here.
Oh, I'm sorry. We have a mic. I forgot about that.
Okay, I don't need a mic.
We're recording. Everyone needs a mic.
I'm being recorded. Oh. Okay, I do need a mic. Well, I have a comment and a question. Mm-hmm. My comment is that what struck me, especially in the Matthew Lipman tape, was how much the students enjoyed what they were doing. They were smiling. They loved it as they were talking to each other. So I think that's a really important point. And I don't know if that's generally true, but that struck me in particularly that trait. My question is, in Ontario, there is a philosophy of for children course used with, I think, primarily older children in secondary school, if I'm correct. And that course actually uses a more historical approach, which is philosophy both East and West. So it's not exclusively Western philosophy, but it goes through kind of briefly historical accounts. And I'm wondering what you think of that, given that that's rather different from the kind of approach that you're advocating. Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate the comment. It is something that I've found kids just really get excited about their learning when we do this. I think it's happening because what they say matters, right? They're not being told to answer something that they've studied and give the right answer. They're working on difficult problems and they get invested in other people to them. That's empowering, right? They get excited about it. I teach philosophy at the college level. I want them to learn some of the history of philosophy and some of the arguments that are out there. So I'm not against doing it in that way. I think it can be deadly at this young age, and high school is sort of the intermediate stage, right? I mean, they're not so different from the first-year students we get at the university level. I still think it helps to try to make sure that the material is accessible to them at their reading level, right? So there are certain things I wouldn't take to, at least the typical high school class. Maybe if you have a very particular class, right, they're better able to handle some of that. So I think, right, there's sort of a shift that can happen where you your purpose might change a little bit. Having said that, I use philosophy for children techniques in my college classes, and students love it. Right? I mean, I'm still trying to teach them particular forms of material, but if I come with a thought experiment or a provocative thing that they can start with and work through, then later we can add in the names and show the particular arguments rather than just slogging through it from the get-go, right? This is the stuff you have to know. I want them to do philosophy about the topics rather than learn the history of philosophy. So, I'm not against it, but I think it at every level should be a bit of a mix of those things and even less history of philosophy early on. Yes.
I'll wait for the mic.
How do you go about encouraging one child to express their idea and thought process without discouraging another child that might want to disagree with the first?
It's a good question. How do we ever do that, really, right? I think a lot of it has to do with, because we're trying to get them to converse with each other, that even in helping somebody formulate a view that's contrary to the first student's, you're treating that first student's idea with respect because you're engaging with it, right? You're saying, this is a really interesting thing. However, right, he's right that it looks like there's this little problem. How would you respond to that? If he can't do it, right, what about the rest of you? Is there a good response that could be offered? I mean, think about professionals. We love to have our work taken seriously. Being criticized is good because it means people are paying attention to what you do. And I think a similar thing's going on at that young level, right? It has to be done respectfully. And we want to make sure people aren't slinging ad hominems at each other, right? But I think done in the right way, you just engage them more. Sometimes, right, so I'm trying to think about the particular thought experiment I did. It must have just been the Ship of Theseus kind of thought experiment as a demonstration class for some of my students with a 4th grade class. And almost everybody, they were clear that it was Ship of Theseus, but with robots, so the robot could actually talk. It's a funny little story, Double Trouble, written by Phil Cam. Everybody in the class, except for one kid, thought that one of the robots was the real Algernon. And so I worked with that one kid. So why don't you think, that's a really interesting point. Have you all thought about this point, right? And I helped him because he was the one kid who was on the other side of this debate. And by the end of the class, right, we didn't push them. We offered them reasons. They were much more split, less sure about their positions, seeing more what that kid had been on about, right? So there's a way to include him, but still keep the other members of the class participating. And one thing I told the workshop earlier, I think it's an interesting result of this that some kids have reported, right, if we do a little evaluation at the end of the philosophy quarter or semester, what did you think about it? What did you learn? They'll say things like, I learned that I can disagree with my best friend. And it's okay, right, to disagree in that way, that we can have differences of opinion that needn't separate us as friends, so we don't have to fight about things. It's interesting, if you talk to young kids early on about what we're doing, we're arguing about things. Ask them what they think an argument is, and they almost always say it's fighting. But that's not what an argument is for philosophers, right? It's seeking truth. They're trying to figure something out rather than having animosity towards each other. Now, professional philosophers, we do sometimes build up a little animosity, but right, I think we're better off when we don't do that. So we want to show them how you can have a reasoned, even if impassioned, argument about something and still agree that at the end of the day, you're not going to agree about the answer to it. Other things? Yeah.
It isn't really a question, it's more of a comment, but I just can't help thinking how extremely important what you're talking about is right now, in particular, as young people are not seeing good discussion modeled very much in many, many places. Mm-hmm. And it also falls along very much the kinds of attitudes and things in our variety and our extreme with quality and just the number of different people and the mixtures that we have and so on today. It can build respect for one another, which I think is absolutely critical. And I also find that so many kids really are not into talking, they're into looking down at their text thing. And I'm seeing quite a difference in even at university level when you're teaching them that there is a lack sometimes of that respect for one another's opinions. So I think it's awesome.
Thanks.
And discussion skills and just everything. I just love it.
I agree, and I think it's not only about the respect, although that I think is an incredibly important component here, but about learning to express yourself in words, right? So I'm an email lover. I'm an addict. I email everybody. This is my way of keeping in touch. I'm not a downer on technology. But right, we sort of lose our ability to hold even a conversation over the phone. My students never call because it's easier and less threatening to email me. But I think about what happens when we engage over a topic on a paper topic, right? I can help you learn and you can help me see what you were working on, and right through this constant interaction, we can actually gain something, and we just are losing that capacity. We don't practice it as much. And I think, again, I'm not against discussion boards or live chat threads, which are much more this and then that and this and that in real time. But I think seeing the way people respond non-verbally, too, matters.
That's what my grandson says, yeah. He
Yeah.
said seeing people, listening to their voice still means more than just getting a text.
Because even with our little emoticons, right, we don't catch the raised eyebrow or the sort of furrowed brow as somebody's saying something. And that's important information for understanding what a person's saying. So I think, it's an important kind of skill to continue developing. Look, we can just pass it right down this line.
In a way, this is a follow-up to Howard Woodhouse's question from before. How have you found the response to philosophy for children on the part of school boards, on more particular schools? And imagining what your answer might be, how do you sell philosophy for children to school boards and to state departments of education? The process of getting that one course onto the approved curriculum in Ontario was the outcome of about a 10-year-long struggle in which, entrenched interest regard this as an idea being imposed from the outside. And I'm wondering, have you encountered the same, and have you developed any good strategies for selling philosophy for children to educational administrators?
So it's a good question. It's a little bit of, I'm of two minds about this. So selling it helps to be able to point to assessment projects that look at standardized tests that right now most districts care about, to say, look, even though we're not focusing on those tests, these are the results coming out. Kids are improving in these capacities, and we have the teacher reports to show it where we've tried it, right, in pockets. It gives us some, I was going to say ammunition. I kind of don't like that metaphor, but it gives us some evidence, right, something to work with. But then I think I don't want philosophy to be the thing that becomes standardized in a way where we have to teach certain things, and where, right, if you don't do it, then you're not doing it right, and right, that we're going to end up doing very close testing of what the philosophy is. I think this is one of those things where we want to say, testing is not the answer for everything. There are other important things in the world. Yes, we want to be able to show what we're getting from doing this process, but not all of that is quantitative data, right? We won't always be able to get that. So I want to use it, but I want to resist it in case that becomes the only way of assessing. Now, when I've done programs like in Long Beach, we had approval from the superintendent of schools there. He was a philosophy major. We lucked out, right? He understood what philosophy was, he valued it, and he was open to experimenting in various schools, trying things out. But we never went district-wide, in part because we didn't have the infrastructure to train teachers to do that, right? We didn't have enough students to send out to partner with people to do that. And we're facing similar concerns in Seattle, because we have a lot of interest, we have courses every quarter, but even so, maybe we have 15 people going out. We have a lot more demand than we have students that we can supply. And so we can't really push to take it district-wide unless we know how we're going to do the training to make sure everybody is ready to teach it or feels comfortable teaching it. To me, it seems like it needs to be this kind of grassroots thing where teachers learn how it helps their students, and then it spreads, as opposed to, we think this is something that's good for you, and it's another thing you have to do. Right? Of course there's going to be a resistance when it comes in that way. One of the ways to sell it is saying, look, the very things that you list in your learning outcomes that you're looking for are things that philosophy can help with. So in language arts, right, understanding language, understanding the words, completing sentences, completing arguments, right, looking for reading comprehension, all these things are going to be aided by doing this kind of skill that also has reading involved in it, even though we're focusing elsewhere. Some of the language arts teachers I've talked to have said, what they're trained primarily to do is talk about plot structure, talk about character development, talk about identifying themes that are in a particular book. When you've done that, okay, then you move to the next book. So I don't want to say every teacher stops there. Good teachers are, of course, going to explore in their own way philosophical themes. But if we can say, we're going to add to that and enrich the thing you're already doing with the book by not just identifying some of these themes, but really grappling with them and exploring them and trying to figure them out, then we're enhancing your curriculum, not adding a new thing that you now have to do, right, and get trained to do and all that sort of thing. But, I don't think that answer is sufficient either. I think it's a longer-term problem, how to pitch it in the right way that doesn't make it into something else, just higher critical thinking skills, right, but that shows how it can contribute, why it's important. Yeah,
can I just add
that'd be great.
Just as somebody who works in the school division here, in the public division, I've found that it's not that difficult to have that grassroots thing go on where if I have a relationship with my administrator and if I come to them with an idea and I'm willing to put the work in, 9 times out of 10 my administrator is going to open up the door and allow me to do that. It's just a matter of will I go through the motions and do the things that I need to do, so that if the administrator has that question from the public, why are you doing this? Are you following the curriculum? What curriculum are you using and adapting? Then I have to be able to, as a professional, show that I've gone through those steps as well. But I've found that creating a course is not that challenging to do, so long as you come with a strong case.
Mm-hmm. She's next, but one of the other things I can say is that Mike is going back. In one of the schools that we work with, we have this philosophical learning community where we had teachers who are interested in it, doing philosophy once a month. Some of them would try it out in their classroom. Some of them had our undergraduate teacher partners with them. And the word spread, right? People got interested in doing this particular thing for their ongoing professional development. We're going to do it again this year, and it's going to be bigger, right? Eventually, we already have teachers at every grade level in that elementary school as part of this. Eventually, I think it may well just become a whole school approach. But it didn't start from the top down, the principal saying you have to do it. It started from the bottom up with some teachers trying it and then spreading the word that they really liked what was happening.
Oh, I was curious about your comment that some of the people that you train who are not necessarily the best candidates are people who can't cope with uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
And so that made me think about how so much of our educational system is based on the right answer, and there's only one right answer. And our, standardized testing
Mm-hmm.
encourages that kind of thinking. And I found that in colleges of education, the students often want this certainty. They want the right answer. They want the recipe to teach, First Nations and Métis kids.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just wondering, how do students, at whatever grade level or level, cope with, I'm imagining that they're involved in discussions where there is uncertainty. How do they unlearn that process of finding the one right answer?
So more the college level students or teachers in training
kids.
or...
The
thing, it's interesting because I think the younger kids have not been trained up in that system yet, right? So they're so good at it. They're very open about it. And, it's later when people get used to being rewarded for having the right answer. And so,
That's
right.
That's what I'm interested in.
So at those stages, I guess I just think, right, because some of the topics are themselves engaging ones. Again, they're these enduring human questions that we all are interested in at some point in our lives, and they don't have easy answers, right? If you're engaged, if you're compelled by the problem presented to you, you see why it's a puzzle or a paradox or something, you want to sort your way out, right? You want to figure out certainty about it, but it's so hard to get there. That's why, as Lena Harwood-Pacheco says, right, it can be frustrating to do philosophy. Oh, I'm so angry because I can't figure it out. But it's also, in its own way, a rewarding frustration, right? Because I'm really thinking deeply about this issue, and I'm discovering that other people aren't even thinking about it in the same way that I am, and maybe they give me help figuring that out. I think there's something in the nature of philosophy, right, that has this unsettled character to it. Right, having said that, not everybody is going to come around as quickly. So I think it's the sort of thing that we get better at with practice, both as teachers and as students in a philosophy discussion.
I just have a quick question about the group nature of the philosophy for children that you're talking about. It seems like, from what I can see, all of it is group discussion based. And I know that about 50% of children are more introverted instead of extroverted, so they like working on their own more individually. And I'm just wondering if philosophy for children encourages that sort of solo flight of thought more, or if it's always group discussion based.
I think it's a really good question. So most of the way we do it is through group discussion. We want to get dialogue going. I would say that we don't want to put pressure on people who don't want to speak up in the big discussion, but we want to give them other avenues to contribute, right? And so some of the little reflective exercises that we do at the end of class can really highlight for you what somebody who's relatively silent and an introvert is thinking about the topic. Of course, right in your classroom, you could have them do other kinds of writing exercises or things that are going to pull out what an individual student is thinking. But what I've also heard from many teachers is that sometimes the quietest students in their regular classes, the ones that they might identify as being very introverted, come out in this kind of discussion, right? Because part of it was a shyness about knowing whether or not they had the right answer, not just an innate shyness about speaking in front of a group. And so, right, again, I think it can build this kind of academic self-esteem. It's not to say I think everybody has to be going gangbusters, but with the young kids, I find a lot of them really do get excited about it. Right, we have to stop them from participating more than we have to try to get everybody involved. All their hands are up, and we've done the closure, and we're trying to leave and go back to classes at the university. Just one more thing, okay, write it down. We'll look at it next time. But they just, if anything, their frustration is that the class is too short, that it ends too soon, and they didn't get to say their piece, maybe. Other questions? I hope that it sounds like you have a program that's starting here. I hope that it works well and that a lot of you will get involved in it if you're even a little bit interested, because, again, our students and I myself have found it incredibly rewarding, and I think it's really good for the kids who do it.